morning. On behalf of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and its Corcoran Chair Conference, let me welcome those of you who are on Zoom and those of you who are with us in the room to the second day of our annual Corcoran Chair Conference, Shared Scripture, Divided Faiths, the Medieval Jewish-Christian Encounter over the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. My name is Ruth Langer. I'm Associate Director of the Center. And very glad to be back as Associate Director after serving as Interim Director for a few years, and to be now here with Daniel Jocelyn-Zimitowski as the Craft Chair and Director of our Center, and with our Corcoran Chair Visiting Scholar for the year, Franz von Lyra, get it right, who has organized this conference. Our first speaker seems not to have joined us on Zoom yet, so we're going to go to our second speaker and begin with Deeana Copeland Klepper, who is Assistant Professor in the Departments of Religion and History at Boston University and holds a PhD in Medieval European History from Northwestern University. Her research focuses on medieval religious identities, cultures, and interreligious encounters. Her publications include The Insight of Unbelievers, Nicholas of Lyra, and Christian Readings of Jewish Texts in the Later Middle Ages from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and Pastoral Care and Community in Late Medieval Germany, Albert of Diessen's Mirror of Priests from Cornell University Press. She is currently at work on a project that explores the range of advice concerning interactions with Jews and Muslims offered in locally oriented manuals for parish priests, comparing works composed in Germany, England, Spain, and Italy. Deeana.
Hi, just give us a second and we'll. Okay. Well, thank you, Franz, for inviting me to participate. Such interesting talks yesterday. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation today. So the most important part of the title of my paper today is the question mark after the words shared scripture. As the very framing of this conference suggests, excuse me, those of us who study medieval Christian and Jewish engagement with the Bible and related texts typically begin with the assumption that we can talk about the Christian Old Testament and the Jewish Tanakh as shared scripture, even if the two bodies of literature varied in content, even if the two communities maintained and read those collections of literature differently. I'm not saying this assumption is necessarily misguided, although I do think it is not entirely accurate. The rich body of Hebrew and Latin polemical literature makes it clear that at some level, medieval Jews and Christians did perceive themselves to be competing to establish ownership of a common set of scriptures. Jewish interpreters pressed certain interpretive approaches over others, partially in response to Christian competition. The Christian Bible correctors of the 13th century worked to align their texts more fully with the Hebrew Bible, and Christian Hebraists from Andrew of St. Victor to Nicholas of Lyra pursued the literal sense of the Bible as a way to harmonize scholastic understanding of Scripture with their perception of the true original, that is, Jewish, understanding of the text. On the other hand, changing the end of a narrative changes an entire story. In some sense, the Christian Old Testament and Hebrew Tanakh cannot be the same Scripture, because the frameworks into which they are set are so different. And Christians and Jews alike recognize the truth of this in their polemical literatures, especially clear to see in the Hebrew and Latin accounts of the Barcelona Disputation of 1263 between Rabbi Moses ben Nachman and Friar Paul Christian, for example. Today, I want to consider this fundamental connection or disconnection of Christian and Jewish scriptures through the lens of Nicholas of Lyra's 1333 work on the differences between the Hebrew letter and our translation. Unlike most works of Christian biblical scholarship that engage with Hebrew text, the De Differentia seems not to be highlighting differences between Christian and Jewish text in pursuit of a fuller alignment, but to establish distinction, to make clear that these texts are not the same and do not need to be the same. Does pointing out all the ways that Christian and Jewish Bibles differ without judgment lead to a sense that we have two different scriptures here? Maybe not, but there is certainly something in the composition and reception of this text that we should be taking into account when we consider the question. I don't want to presume that the audience, that everyone knows something about Nicholas of Lyra, so let me give just a very quick introduction. Nicholas, a Franciscan friar who lived from about 1270-ish to 1349, was arguably the most important and influential Christian Bible commentator of the later Middle Ages. His literal postilla on the entire Bible, which emphasized the literal sense of Scripture and the importance of the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic tradition in discerning it, was enthusiastically received even as it was being completed, and appeared in countless manuscript copies and printed editions. By countless, I mean hundreds upon hundreds. Nicholas's postilla served as a guide to the literal sense of Scripture for generations of Christian scholars, not only fellow exegetes, but also translators of the Latin Bible into vernaculars. Recently, scholars of English literature have begun to identify the important role Nicholas's postilla played in the first translation of the Bible into Middle English by the followers of John Wycliffe, for example, and similar projects are underway for translators of early Czech Bibles. Apart from its comprehensiveness and clarity, what rendered Nicholas's Bible commentary compelling, what led to its domination of the marketplace, was his interweaving of biblical and post-biblical Hebrew tradition with ancient and medieval Christian interpretations and strategies. Given the importance of Nicholas's perceived expertise in Hebrew and Jewish interpretation in the success of the postilla, it is strange that a related piece he produced to further address distinctions between the Hebrew Bible and the Latin translation seems to have been so neglected by medieval, early modern, and modern scholars alike. Nicholas wrote on the differences between the Hebrew letter and our translation in 1333, immediately after he completed his literal commentary on the entire Bible, even before he sat down to write a companion moral commentary to his literal one. In his prologue to the work, he made it clear that he saw it as an important extension of the postilla. And yet, if we consider the manuscript tradition, it seems that the De Differentia got little traction. Only around 20 extant manuscript copies of the work have been identified, compared to hundreds upon hundreds of manuscripts containing Nicholas's other works. Given how strong Nicholas's reputation was by that point, and the apparent interest in his Hebraism specifically, why did contemporaries not pick up this work with the same enthusiasm they did everything else he wrote? Was there something about his approach in the work that made it a particular challenge? Apart from 4 pages in an essay by Gilbert Dahan on Lyra's hermeneutics, the De Differentia is virtually unstudied. And as an aside, because Dahan, those 4 pages, limited his attention to a handful of chapters in Genesis, which I'll talk about more later, is something of an exception to the rest of the work, he seriously underestimated the extent to which the postilla and the De Differentia diverge. This is partly because scholars have taken Lyra at his word and treated the De Differentia as an abridgment of the postilla. I certainly thought of it that way until I actually spent time with it. But a closer examination of the text shows that it must be approached on its own terms. And I believe that a fuller assessment of the text, I'm not going to do the full assessment today in my half hour, but as an ongoing project, a fuller assessment of the text will contribute not only to our understanding of Nicholas and the reception of his work, but also to our understanding of later medieval Christian Hebraism. And perhaps it may also enrich the way we think about the relationship between Jewish and Christian scriptures, shared or not, in medieval context. To that end, I'd like to give you an overview of the work, illustrate its content with a few excerpts from the text, and then review what we know of its reception, concluding with a few words about how understanding the fate of the De Differentia might help us reevaluate Christian interest in the Hebrew Bible and its interpretation in the 14th century and beyond. Nicholas explained in his prologue to the De Differentia that he had 3 reasons for pursuing the project. First, although he sometimes made note of variations between Latin and Hebrew scripture in the postilla, he did not do so systematically or comprehensively, and so now he wants to attend more fully to those distinctions, as they are essential to understanding the increasing understanding of truth. Second, the vast size of the postilla put it beyond the means of poor students, whereas he sees the present little work as something that will be inexpensive and available to any student. And third, the issue of variance between the Hebrew Bible and Latin translation will be more apparent if those places are addressed coherently as a distinct project, separate from the inclusion of variance as part of a broader discussion of the literal sense of Scripture. The first and third points highlight how important Nicholas believed this knowledge to be for understanding Christian Scripture in its entirety. The second communicates Nicholas's hope that the work would be widely read and incorporated into the study of the Bible. While Nicholas specifically mentions poor students as his intended audience, he might not have meant that literally. He may simply have meant to communicate that he hoped it would be widely copied and utilized. Why? Nicholas was not trying to create a community of Hebrew scholars. He does not include Hebrew text, almost never transliterates Hebrew words into Latin characters. Rather, he translates Hebrew variations as literally as possible into Latin, using rabbinic commentary when necessary to make sense of the difference. What did he hope Christian scholars would get out of this knowledge? Nicholas describes the work as something short, an opusculum, but the De Differentia is not insubstantial. It takes up 112 folios of highly abbreviated text in the one surviving single text manuscript. The surviving manuscripts often include the word treatise in the title or tract, but it looks and functions like a commentary, and I think we should avoid using the term treatise for the work, as Nicholas didn't use it, and it is misleading. Nicholas quotes a passage of Latin scripture he intends to address, most often 3 to 6 words, then inserts the abbreviation for Hebraica, followed by the equivalent passage in literal translation from the Hebrew into Latin. He sometimes adds a few words of explanation after the Hebrew translation, especially if it requires a significant deviation from common Christian literal interpretation of the passage. But these are most often just 1 or 2 sentences, and you can see in this slide how short each entry typically is. So each of these markers, the red and blue markers, that's a new entry that he's talking about. Here's a close-up so that this is chapter 24, and then we have first 1, 2, 3 entries in chapter 24, and now we've moved on to chapter 26. They're very short. Nicholas worked his way from Genesis through all the books of the Old Testament that were considered part of the Hebrew canon, organized according to their place in the Latin Vulgate. Since he was only interested in passages where the Hebrew and Latin differ, and since he rarely duplicates information found in the postilla, he skips over many chapters. Genesis is an outlier, as he includes something from all but 3 chapters of the book, but in Numbers, he offers comment in only 19 of 36 chapters, in Job, 27 out of 42 chapters, in Jeremiah, 35 out of 52 chapters, and so on. The number of individual passages discussed in each book also varies widely, depending obviously on the length of the book, but also the nature of the Latin translation itself and the extent of Nicholas's previous treatment of difference in the postilla. Psalms and Genesis contain far and away the most material, with 232 and 106 entries, respectively. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Esther has just 4 entries, Ruth and Daniel 5 each. I love this kind of research by counting through medieval manuscripts. How many? The Postilla Literalis was meant to provide a thorough understanding of the literal sense of the entire Bible in conversation with the long tradition of Christian biblical interpretation. And in that work, Nicholas invoked the Hebrew letter and rabbinic interpretation in the service of literal exegesis. But in the De Differentia, the goal is somewhat reversed. The primary purpose of the work is to establish the biblical letter itself, maybe I should say letters themselves, by systematically comparing the Hebrew and Latin. When Nicholas invokes Christian or Jewish interpretation, it is to help clarify divergence, usually at a very basic level. The two works, the Postilla and the De Differentia, are not only different in their goals, but in their specific content as well. In the book of Job, which I'll use today for purposes of illustration, Nicholas identifies 50 biblical passages in which he says the Latin differs from the Hebrew. Of these 50 passages, only 6 had been discussed in the Postilla Literalis. This means close to 90% of the material in the De Differentia on Job is new. Nicholas cites Rashi 3 times in the De Differentia on Job, and not one of those 3 citations had appeared previously in the Postilla on Job, which contained 11 of its own citations of Rashi. Although Nicholas suggested in his prologue that the De Differentia was somehow an affordable alternative to the Postilla, a close comparison shows this is true only in the most general sense of works clarifying Hebrew. The De Differentia is not an abridgment or summary of the Postilla as it is often described, and they are not interchangeable works. So let's take a look at some examples from the De Differentia on Job to give you a sense of the text and its relationship to the Postilla. The first 2 examples overlap that I'm going to give you overlap with the Postilla, and the last 3 do not. The first passage from Job that Nicholas addresses is chapter 3, verse 4, and it's a verbatim repetition from the Postilla concerning a correction to the Vulgate, a known correction to the Vulgate, and let it not be remembered is not present in the Hebrew or in corrected books, but let God not regard it from above is followed directly by nor the light shine upon it. Straightforward, simple correction. The second passage in Nicholas's treatment of Job is taken likewise from the Postilla, but in this case represents a drastic abridgment of his earlier discussion. So Job 3:8 reads, "Who are prepared to rouse Leviathan, that is a demon, whom evil men are prepared to rouse by obedience to him, and they hate the light of day," John 3. The Hebrew, expecting, that is desiring, to be separated from their society. And such are men who are so oppressed by misery that they desire to be drawn away from the society of the living by death. Compare with the Postilla. I need 2 slides to compare with the Postilla, and the things I want you to pay attention to are highlighted in yellow. Let them curse it who curse the day, or who are prepared to rouse Leviathan. Thomas explains this according to the literal sense in 2 ways. In one way, I'm going to just read really fast, and that we ought to understand a great fish, which is called by the name whale, and on account of whose greatness fishermen do not dare to go out to attack him by day, as it is said, but only at night, and therefore, if when they intend to capture him and day comes, they curse it and thus raise Leviathan in order to attack him. Or, in another way, Thomas says, by Leviathan is to be understood the devil, whom evil men have raised up through obedience to him, and these men hate the light of day, according to what is said in John 3. But the first explanation does not seem to be true, because I have heard from those who know how to capture that fish saying it is never hunted at night, but only in the light of day so they can throw a spear from far away, because otherwise they would be cast overboard. And the second explanation is seen to be mystical. So I intend to offer a different literal interpretation from that which the Hebrews offer, saying that this is the true letter, and then he gives us what appears here in the De Differentia. This is now the same slide you saw before the Postilla. In place of a long presentation and refutation of Thomas Aquinas' attempt at literal interpretation of the passage, Aquinas' view simply becomes the Christian literal sense, juxtaposed with a reading from Hebrew drawn from rabbinic commentary. In the Postilla, most of the space is given over to a discussion of the problems with Christian interpretations of the text, with a determination in favor of a tradition of the Hebrews at the end. In the De Differentia, space gets used more evenly. Latin text with brief Christian interpretation, Hebrew text with brief Jewish interpretation. Furthermore, traditions rejected in the Postilla are left to stand in the De Differentia, and the Jewish opinion that Nicholas preferred as the correct literal interpretation for Christians is simply presented here as the Hebrew letter. Note that there is no discussion of the superiority or inferiority of either Christian or Jewish interpretation, no preference stated. But most entries in Job had not been covered in the Postilla. In Job 9:12, we see a very typical approach to difference. The Latin text is followed by Hebrew text with a very short comment to help make sense of the difference. If he questions suddenly, who will answer him? Hebrew, behold, he takes something, who will restore it? And then he adds, as if to say, since none is of limitless virtue. In the postilla, Nicholas hadn't addressed the Hebrew variation at all, but his interpretation of the Latin emphasized the unworthiness of any human to answer God, who is of limitless virtue. The two texts contain different material, but work well together. Job 29:18 has Nicholas turning to Rashi for help with simple translation. It reads, and like a palm tree I will multiply my days, for the palm is a tree that lives a long time. Hebrew, and like a whole I will multiply my days, and Rashi says that whole is the name of a bird with an exceptionally long life. The postilla on Job 29:18 had followed the Latin letter exclusively and so made no use of Rashi for the literal sense, while the De Differentia depended upon Rashi's identification of the word. One final example shows a more exegetically significant use of Rashi for the literal sense in Job 26:13. And by his midwiving hand, the twisted snake was brought forth, Hebrew, and his hand killed the twisted snake, which Rashi explains concerning Pharaoh, whom the Lord killed in the Red Sea, and he is called here twisted snake because he retracted many promises he had made to the children of Israel concerning their release. In the postilla, Nicholas addressed only the Latin text, explaining the passage in terms of God's power, allowing the devil to fall, and taking the form of the snake in the Garden of Eden. Since he did not introduce the Hebrew variant of the text in the postilla, he did not introduce Rashi either. I hope this brief introduction through the example of Job, through this introduction, you can see that it would not have been redundant for a library to keep a copy of the De Differentia alongside the postilla, or for someone with access to the postilla to keep their own copy of the De Differentia. The dearth of surviving manuscripts is therefore puzzling. Does it suggest that the project was a relative failure among Lyra's widely circulated corpus? Was the De Differentia truly unappreciated? Or is something else going on? There are hints in the manuscript tradition that suggest we might be seeing a failure of survival rather than a lack of interest in the work. Though few in number, the extant manuscript copies come from a fairly wide swath of territory, having been produced in France, Italy, Germany, Bohemia, I'm getting ahead of myself, or maybe I'm not. Okay. They appear, let's see, France, Italy, Germany, Bohemia, Austria, and Spain. They date from 1348 to 1463, with more than half of them from the 14th century. And they appear in a range of contexts. Many appear as part of a collection of Nicholas's shorter works, usually one or both of the anti-Jewish treatises. Sometimes they appear in full copies, lavishly illuminated multi-volume copies of the postilla. Sometimes they appear in a miscellany with other authors. And let me just show you a few examples of various kinds. Here's the oldest dated copy we have from 1348, so very close to the time of its composition, with in a volume with 3 other Lyra texts. Or this is an example where the text exists alongside the 2 anti-Jewish treatises, later bound to a theological miscellany, but clearly not part of that miscellany originally. Here's an example of the lavishly illuminated variety, and from Italy, perhaps even more lavishly illuminated variety. Here is a working copy with Lyra questions and the postilla on just the Solomonic books. And that just gives you a rough sense of what we're looking at. Given the way Nicholas introduced the text in his prologue as something poor students could afford to own, I would have expected to find many small copies of the text on its own, in quarto or octava volumes, as we have for Nicholas's question on the advent of Christ or response to a certain Jew. And yet so far, I have found only one single text manuscript copy of the De Differentia. However, that one manuscript, Avignon Bibliothèque Municipale 35, along with a German miscellany and an odd 1515 printed edition that fused elements of the postilla and the De Differentia under the title Book on the Differences in the Old Testament, are collectively suggestive of a possible lost tradition. So the Avignon manuscript is the kind of single text witness I imagine Nicholas hoped he would be produced. It's a small book, 112 folios, the size of a modern paperback, heavily rubricated for ease of use. Were there more such books now lost? If they were owned by individuals rather than religious houses or colleges, they would have been less likely to survive. The Avignon copy came from the Dominican convent, which may account for its survival. It's also the only copy I've seen where a reader annotated a passage with Hebrew and Latin transliteration. It's this one page at the beginning of the book of Isaiah, and it is just this one page. The partial copy in Hamilton MS-21 offers possible evidence for now lost books of the sort found in the Avignon manuscript. It is a large theological miscellany on paper dated between 1340 and 1400. It contains, did I say that it's German? I lost track. It's German. It contains Nicholas's Postilla Moralis on the Pentateuch and the De Differentia on Genesis, Exodus, and a few chapters of Psalms, along with a diverse range of other texts. The jump from Exodus to Psalms occurs in the middle of a page. So either the scribe decided to skip a large part of the work, which strikes me as unlikely, or the scribe only had a section of the work. Psalms drops off abruptly after just a few chapters, with the rest of that page left blank. The hand changes when the new text begins on the next folio. There's something curious about the partial presentation of the De Differentia in this codex. And beyond the manuscript tradition lies one final hint at a lost tradition, which is the 1515 text that I mentioned. An enterprising printer in Alcalá near Madrid combined content from the Postilla Literalis and the De Differentia, bringing relevant traditions from both works into a single text. As Klaus Reinhardt has argued, the 1515 edition demonstrates that the De Differentia must have been known and valued in Spain, even though we have just the one surviving copy that I showed you. Now, it is possible that the limited survival of manuscript copies of the De Differentia is just that, an issue of survival, not initial circulation. And if we were talking about anyone except Nicholas of Lyra, we might be thinking that this is actually an impressive manuscript tradition. We might even argue for the popularity of the text. But for someone with as huge a reputation as Nicholas, I think we can call this work something of a failure. Did Nicholas's approach in the De Differentia make people uncomfortable? Was its purpose and value unclear? Why catalog the ways in which Christian scripture differed from Hebrew scripture, if not to reconcile the two? Or, as someone asked yesterday, to separate the true from the false? This is an odd work. It's difficult to assimilate into Nicholas's career and the narrative of Christian Hebrew study in the Middle Ages. I began my talk by suggesting that Nicholas seemed to point to an understanding of Christian and Jewish scripture as fundamentally different. And I don't mean to overstate my case. I can see, of course, the ways in which these two bodies of literature are in some sense the same. But I also want to take Lyra's insistent presentation of their difference seriously, perhaps as a point of departure for the way we think about these interactions. Thank you.
I see that our Johannes Heil, who was supposed to be our first speaker, is now on Zoom, so we will turn to him next. Let me give a second. Oh, so let's go on to the third speaker then, and then we'll go to him after that, sorry. So we turn now to Görge Hasselhoff, whose talk is titled The Impact of the Parisian Talmud Trials on Christian Theology, Translating the Talmud, Rashi, and Maimonides. Görge Hasselhoff is adjunct professor at the Technical University of Dortmund. He earned his PhD in Heidelberg and has written a book on the image of Maimonides in the Latin West in the 13th to 15th centuries. He has been a research assistant at the Universities of Heidelberg and Bonn and a research fellow at the University of Bochum. He is currently editing a book on Raymond Marty's polemical work, The Pugio Fidei. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've also been a guest professor in Brazil and Spain. First of all, I would like to thank for the kind invitation here to Boston. It's not my first time here in Massachusetts, but it's nice to be back here. With my talk, we jump back in time a little to the 1230s or 40s. My talk is divided into 5 sections. I will start with some reflections on the Parisian Talmud trials. I will then turn to the Latin translation of the Talmud itself. We then will have a short look at the translations of texts by Rashi and some poets, before I turn to the translation of Maimonides. Finally, I will try to give a short outlook. So my first point, the Parisian Talmud trials of the 1240s. In the 1230s, a Jew from La Rochelle in Normandy converted to Christianity. His name was Nicolas Donat. Only little is known about his life. Perhaps he belonged to a group of non-Karaites, that is, a group of Jews who did not believe in the Talmudic traditions, but were not counted among the Karaites of the East. Perhaps Donat belonged to a group of Maimonidians in a non-Maimonidian surrounding of northern France. We even do not know why and when he left his Jewish community, but it seems that he lived for a while without any ties to any religious group at all. Around 1236, he seems to have been baptized. In 1238 or 9, he addressed Pope Gregory IX and accused his former fellow Jews of blaspheming Christ in their new book of the Talmud. To give proof of that thesis, he translated some 35 passages from the Talmud, yet we do not know into which language, but it seems to have been a Romance dialect. Now, what's remarkable in that story is that the Pope reacted to the accusation. We do not know what the Holy See at that time was like. It was definitely not as hermetically closed as nowadays. But anyway, it is remarkable that the Pope was informed about the accusation at all. Perhaps the Dominican order was already involved in that case. Anyway, the Pope reacted to that. He addressed all Christian kings that they should inquire the case. Only one king, the King of France, Louis IX, reacted to the Pope's request. In 1240, he invited Nicolas Donat and the leaders of the Parisian congregation for public disputation, or to be more precise, for trial. That was interrupted after 2 days. Nonetheless, in 1241 or 2, a public burning of some Hebrew and Aramaic writings, perhaps even a copy of the Talmud itself, took place in Paris on Place de la Grève. It was a horrible occurrence, but the report about 24 cartloads is definitely exaggerated. As Colette Sirat has shown, there could not have been so many book copies at the time. Just as a reminder, a huge university library at Paris or Oxford owned about 200 books in 1250. So 24 cartloads cannot be the case at all. And Colette Sirat also adds there were not so many sheep to be killed to form so many copies of the Talmud at all at the time. We also know that some of the confiscated books were returned to the Parisian Jewish community sometime later. Since the Bishop of Tusculum, Odo of Châteauroux, did not want to leave it at that, he urged Pope Innocent IV, after his election in 1243, to review the case. It ended with a condemnation of the Talmud, but not a further burning, in 1248. That condemnation was signed by the Parisian professors, including Albert the Great, and the Bishop of Paris, William of Auvergne. So far, so bad. Yet, despite these ugly anti-Jewish political actions against the Talmud and the Talmud trial itself, and the accompanying actions also had some remarkable positive side effects, namely Latin translations of several Jewish texts. to start with my second point, the many translations of the Talmud between 1239 and 48. First of all, I have to mention the several translations of the Talmud into Latin. There are altogether 3 Latin translations of the Talmud from the 1230s and 40s preserved. As mentioned before, it started with Nicolas Donat's translations of about 35 passages from 15 treatises from 4 or 5 orders. That depends on whether we count Berachot to Zeraim or not, because the rest of Zeraim is not quoted at all. All excerpts comprise 4 to 46 lines in the modern edition by Piero Capelli, altogether 559 lines. So it's not that extensive, but it's a long translation. It's not clear whether Dahan was able to speak and write Latin. It seems quite likely that he provided a translation into Romance and had a second translator who translated from the Romance into Latin, perhaps at the Dominican convent Saint-Jacques in Paris. That translation served as a basis of the Talmud trials, but it was also copied several further times. In 1245, that is, after Odo of Châteauroux had urged to reopen the case, at least 2 translators without Dahan, who seem to have belonged to the Dominican convent Saint-Jacques, worked through a copy of the Talmud and supplied a list of 1922 Latin excerpts from 4 or 6 orders, following the chronological order of the Aramaic manuscripts. It seems that the Talmud copy the translators used contained only the orders Moed, Nashim, Yeshua, blessings, that is Nezikim, but with a different name, and Kodashim. These 4 orders seem to have been added by the treatise Berachot that was attached to Moed. In the Latin writing, they say Berachot from Moed. And the treatise Nida from Torot, together with the Masechet Kala, that is counted among the minor treatises that became excluded from the Talmud, but in the 1240s seem to have belonged to it. All excerpts are collected more or less in sequential order compared with its Vorlage. So the translators followed the writings they had and annotated it and wrote down all the excerpts that they provided. From these 4+ orders, there are quotations from altogether 27 treatises. That is, from most of the treatises of these orders, namely 6 in average. In addition, we may state that the original Aramaic version contained comments by Rashi, because these comments were translated together with the Talmud excerpts. The first copy of that translation is lost. But it seems that one of the first readers added marginal notes that qualified the excerpts according to a certain scheme. These marginal notes were copied in the later manuscripts. These marginal notes might have been added by one of the Dominican friars who provided the third translation. That third translation is a revision of the second sequential translation. It is nonetheless a new work because now the order is completely changed. This third translation is ordered systematically, and all excerpts known, as well as new excerpts, are put into 13 chapters. For example, de Auctoritate Talmud, of the authority of the Talmud, de Blasphemiis contra Christum, of the blasphemies against Christ, de Erroribus, about the errors, de Stultitiis, the, well, I don't know the English expression, the stubbornness, the mistakes, the stupidness, I guess this. De Fabulis, we discussed this subject yesterday. And it's altogether 13 sections, and all these sections follow the annotations in the second translation. Again, we do not know who the redactor and translator was, perhaps Henry the German, but most likely it was finished before the final condemnation of the Talmud in 1248. In addition to these 3 translations, Dahan, chronological and systematic, I have to mention one further Latin translation, which is an unsolved riddle. In the Aramaic Talmud manuscripts today kept in Florence, Italy, a scribe added Latin translations that are only in part identical with the translations introduced so far. Perhaps it stems from the Dominican scriptorium, or another scholar reworked the translation that he already knew. But other than the other text, the Florence excerpts are not yet edited. And I was part in a research group in Catalonia where we edited this text, and Ulisse Cicchini and Oscar de la Cruz Palma did so. It's 2 huge volumes in the Corpus Christianorum series. And last week I showed them to my eldest son and said, "Oh, look here, this is 400 euro and this is 350 euro. And he said, "Who buys these books?" I don't know, but we are currently preparing a 3rd volume with all the text, the rest texts, but without the Florence excerpts. I come to my 3rd point: translating Rashi and further texts. In the manuscripts that contain the 2nd sequential translation, we find further Hebrew texts translated. The first is a translation of poetic texts, so-called piyutim. This translation is called Liber Krubot. Some of its texts can be identified as poems by Benjamin Bar Shmuel, circa 12th century. Others cannot be identified. Therefore, it is not clear who authored the compilation of the Sefer Keruvah that served as a Vorlage. It is interesting to note that the translation contains comments by Rashi. The Piyut themselves are a poetic exegesis of biblical texts. For example, Numbers 19:16, Psalm 137:7, and so on. Rashi himself is a further author who was translated at the same time. As mentioned before, a 2nd and 3rd translation of the Talmud, as well as the Liber Krubot, contain comments by Rashi, who taught at Troyes at the last 3rd of the 11th century. In addition to those comments, some manuscripts contain a list of circa 160 excerpts from Rashi's Bible commentaries, which is, compared with Rashi's all writings altogether, not that much, but it is 160 excerpts. These excerpts cover the Pentateuch, some of the prophetic books, and some of the Ketuvim, and they are all edited by Gilbert Dahan or myself, and I'm going to collect everything in a new article providing a complete list of all these roughly 160 excerpts. It's very difficult to count them because there's sometimes there are 2 verses explained in one excerpt, and sometimes it's one verse being explained twice in different ways. So the counting is only roughly 160. All translations mentioned so far in one way or other are connected to each other. But they are not the only translations of Jewish writings from the 1230s and 40s. So my 4th point is Maimonides translations before and after the Talmud trials. A further author whose works were translated at that time is Moshe ben Maimon, the Rabbi Moses of the scholastic era. My thesis, developed nearly 25 years ago and perhaps known by some of you, connects some of these Maimonides translations to the Talmud trial and the Talmud translations. It is a well-known fact that Maimonides wrote halachic, philosophical, and medical treatises. The first work of these translated into Latin was The Guide for the Perplexed, from 1190. Today we know 3 partial Latin translations of that book. The first is a partial translation of Book 3, chapters 29 and 30, and 32 to 49. That is Maimonides' summary of Mishnah Torah and the explanation of the biblical commandments in the frame of his philosophical encyclopedia. The translation was incorporated into an anonymously transmitted treatise called Liber de Parabola, Book of the Parable. It was written around 1223 to 25, and the author discussed the problem of one particular biblical commandment, namely why Leviticus 2 it is demanded to add salt and to sacrifice the sacrifice with salt but without honey. To this explanation, the anonymous author added, without introduction or any reference to the author, the chapters mentioned before from the guide, Book 3. Today we know only one manuscript of that treatise, but it was read and used at least by William of Auvergne and by Jean de la Rochelle in his Summa Hallensis. A second partial translation is called Liber de Uno Deo Benedicto, Book of the One Blessed God. It appeared around 1242 or 3 in Paris and was first used by Albert the Great. That liber contains the introduction and chapter 1 of the Guide for the Perplexed, book 2. That is the summary of the Aristotelian sayings about God's and the world's eternity and Maimonides' proofs of God's existence. And we don't know which text served as a Vorlage. It could have been the translation by Ibn Tibbon or the translation by Al-Kharisi. It's more likely that it was the Ibn Tibbon translation, but nonetheless, it is a complete riddle why and where this translation was made. I assume it was, as well as the other one that I'm going to talk about right now, made in Paris, but this is speculation. The first one should have been done in southern France, perhaps in Toulouse, because the addressee lived there at the time. But we don't know. Perhaps it was also made in Spain or in Italy or elsewhere. But now I come to my main point. In about 1246, for the first time, a Christian scholar, namely again Albert the Great, mentions the Dux Neutrorum, which is an abbreviated version of all 3 books of the Guide for the Perplexed, that is added by a list of all biblical precepts. That list serves as an introduction to some manuscripts of Mishnah Torah. There have been a number of theories as to where the translation was provided. A first idea for the place of the translation was uttered in the 19th century by Heinrich Hirsch Grätz, who speculated that the translation was provided at the imperial court in the Kingdom of Sicily under Frederick II because he employed Michael Scotus as a translator and knew an argument from the Guide for the Perplexed, as can be shown by Jacob Anatolis Malmat HaTalmidim. But there remain at least 2 questions that cannot be answered. Firstly, why should a member of the Ibn Tibbon family translate Maimonides from a version that was not produced by them? It's quite unlikely that Anatoly carried Al-Kharisi problematic translation to the emperor's court if he had the translation by his father in law at his disposal. Secondly, and this is the main point, the Dux Neutrorum follows the Al-Kharisi translation, and only in later times there were corrections made from the Ibn Tibbon Hebrew version. Secondly, scholars cannot provide any convincing argument why the translation should have been made in Italy in the 1230s, when the first to quote from it was Albert the Great in the middle of the 1240s in Paris. Thirdly, sometimes it is argued that manuscripts which might be dated to the 1260s or 70s as copies from the Ottoboni collection in the Vatican and the one in Todi, seem to bear reference to the Ibn Tibbon translation, so that they indicate a translation in Italy. This argument is raised by the editor Di Segni and by Caterina Rigo. But the Ottoboni manuscript stems from Arras, which is not in Italy, and more important, they are both together not the oldest manuscripts. In the 1950s, Wolfgang Klucksen came up with the idea that the translation was made in southern France. He had 2 main arguments for that thesis. First, the Dominicans were engaged in the Maimonides controversy in southern France and burned Maimonides' writings. Second, the convent in Toulouse was a perfect place for translating Maimonides, at least for the compilation known as the Liber de Parabola. And his third argument, as he told me in a private conversation in 2000, was that his Dr. Vater, Josef Koch, had told him to write down in southern France. So this was his main argument, but he could not write this in the publications. Against the first 2 arguments, one can simply hold, firstly, that the Dominicans were not engaged in the Maimonides controversy at all, as can be shown from the inquisitorial documents. And as Josef Schwarz holds, there had never been a burning of Maimonidean writings at all, and the burning was an invention by Hillel of Verona. And secondly, we do not know of any translation provided in Toulouse or its surroundings at all. A few years ago, Caterina Rigo speculated that the translation must have been made in Barcelona or surroundings, since there were similarities in the translation to works by Hillel of Verona. But if the translation cannot be made in southern Italy or in southern France or in Catalonia, where then might it have been translated? Elsewhere, I have demonstrated that in Book 1, most discussions that link Maimonides to the philological and rabbinical world are left out or they are abbreviated to a minimum. This fact points to a place of the translation where rabbinical Judaism did not stand in high respect. For the Christian side, this was the case in Paris in the 1240s. In addition, there are a number of further arguments that make Paris a most likely place for a Latin translation. There are some external arguments for my hypotheses. Firstly, the first users of the translation were in Paris when they encountered it for the first time. All of them were Dominicans, such as Albert the Great. A second external argument is the economical. Who might have been interested in translation and could supply the financial and human resources? With regard to the financial resources, the imperial court in Sicily could have been a candidate. But the human resources seem to have been situated in Paris in the 1240s. As said before, the only translator known by name in Sicily belonged to the Ibn Tibbon family and cannot have been interested in translating Al-Kharisi. Furthermore, all members of that translator family, Ibn Tibbon, provided their name in a colophon or in translator's preface. In all known manuscripts of the Dux Nautorum, we do not find a translator's name. On the other hand, as shown before, the Dominican convent of Saint-Jacques in Paris had both the interest in Jewish literature for theological and political reasons, and the financial means, be it that they had friars able to read Hebrew or money to pay a translator from the Jewish community in Paris. Here, Nicolas Donin, but also another famous convert, Theobaldus de Saxonia, or Henricus Teutonicus come into play. Even if it was not them who translated the Dux Nautorum, it shows that the convent hosted people who had an interest in Hebrew. And since already in the Talmud translations we do not find a name of the translator apart from that of Donin, it is no wonder that we do not find any for Maimonides. Then there's an internal argument that I already touched before. We know that there were connections between the Jewish communities of northern France and the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula where Al-Kharisi wrote his translation. And we know that at least Moshe of Coucy, who lived in Paris in the 1240s, and who was invited for this unfamous Talmud trial, that he had a strong interest in Maimonides. Moshe of Coucy took part in the Parisian Talmud trial, as we know from the Hebrew report. In his Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, Smak, he paraphrased the Maimonidean discussions of all 613 mitzvot of the Hebrew Bible. If he was able to do so, he must have had Maimonidean writings at his disposal. This was the case. He followed the Maimonidean order of precepts as it was laid down in Mishnah Torah. Since after the first disputation of Paris, the Inquisition collected Jewish books that were later returned to the Jewish community, it is not impossible that Maimonides was among these writings. But this is admittedly only speculation. Nonetheless, Moshe of Coucy's main work points to another interesting point within the Latin translation that was seldom, if ever, discussed. The Latin translation is added by a list of 613 precepts of the Bible, which is not part of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, but in the form translated part of the introduction of Mishnah Torah, as is the case with Moshe of Coucy's Smak. Yet, who might have been interested in these precepts? With regard to the title of this conference, it might be that this Maimonidean text, together with the philosophical considerations, gave enough reason to translate Maimonides. Summary and outlook. To summarize, the Talmud trial of 1239 to 40 and the papal as well as the Dominican actions connected seemed to be a turning point in the history of Jewish-Christian encounters. The attack of a convert from Judaism to Christianity triggered a translation movement that lasted less than a decade, but provided a relatively huge number of Jewish writings in Latin. Several attempts were made to provide translations of the Talmud. Although the result is not a complete version of the Talmud, as was provided 1 century before with the Quran, but a polemical work, it nonetheless provides some insights into the halachic and agadic traditions. Accompanying to that particular translations, poetic and exegetical writings were made available. These translations were read and quoted by scholars like Albert the Great. And it means he quoted from all of these writings. He quotes from the Talmud, he quotes extensively from the Duxnotorum, and it might be that he knew Rashi, although he does not quote him at all. But he quotes from the Talmud translation, so he came across the name Rabbi Salomo. In addition, they were copied several times in the next centuries in several European places. And a philosophical Jewish position that by Maimonides was translated as kind of a counter-image of a Jew who used ratio and could add to Christian thinking. And as a perfect addition, Maimonides offered a survey of all biblical precepts, which were interesting for biblical scholars on the Christian side. These translations did not remain the only ones. Throughout the 13th century, at least 1 commentary by Rashi on the Song of Songs was translated anonymously. It was edited by Sarah Kamin some 40 years ago or 30 years ago. After the Barcelona disputation of 1263, another chapter was opened. The Dominican friar Ramon Martí provided a huge number of Hebrew and Aramaic texts in Latin translation, but that is definitely another story. So for this point, I just have to say thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're going to turn now to our first speaker, who is now, as far as we know, securely on Zoom. That's me, not him. Johannes Heil is joining us from Germany. His talk is titled The Other Diaspora, Roman Jews and Latin Jewish Texts from 400 to 800. You want to make connections here? Yeah. Johannes Heil is professor for the religion, history, and culture of European Jewry at the Hochschule für jüdische Studien in Heidelberg. His research focuses on history, religion, and culture of the Jews in Europe and in the Middle Ages and early modern times, general textual and intellectual history, especially of the Middle Ages, and political, cultural, and religious aspects of Jewish-Christian relations. That is a German-length sentence in that introduction. He recently co-edited the volume From Theodulf to Rashi and Beyond, Texts, Techniques, and Transfer in Western European Exegesis from 800 to 1100. It just came out with Brill in 2022. So we'll need a second for technical transitions. No, I see that he's here and on.
So, first of all, good morning and sorry for the delay. I didn't realize that the summertime is already in Boston since the weekend. So I counted Boston being 6 hours away, and I understand it's only 5 hours at the moment. So thank you for this misunderstanding, for your patience, and I hope you can hear me well. Okay, that's fine. And I will, I can't yet present my presentation. Should I receive the permission to share my screen? Oh, I have the impression now it's working. So I hope you can see the presentation? Okay, sounds good. So, so thank you for inviting me, and also thank you for your understanding that for family reasons, it was a little bit dense to come to Boston and to stay away for longer here, as my mother is seriously ill since a couple of months. So I hope this is going well, that you can follow me well. Please interrupt me in case that you don't understand me properly. There was an interruption in the transmission of the previous lecture for a few seconds, but then it went fine, and I hope everything will be fine. According to a memorial inscription of the Roman theater at Ostia, Marcus Aurelius Pylades had been born in Skytopolis sometime in the second half of the 3rd century, and after having served as a decurio in Damascus and Ashkelon, he had moved to the west and became a celebrated actor at the stage of Ostia. After his death, the memorial plate, which tells us these details, was erected at public request by his friends from the Order of the Augustalis. Given that the reading of the somewhat fragmentary inscription is correct, the name of Pylades' father was Judah, and most probably they were Jews. Some doubts remain. We do not know the name of the mother, and Marcus Aurelius Pylades does not sound Jewish at all. However, as we know from numerous other examples, the standard onomastic formula, which we would expect, do not really help us to identify Jews in antiquity, especially not in the west of the Mediterranean. Antonius, Flavius, Flavia, and others do not sound Jewish either, but they refer undoubtedly to Jews, as those names are to be found in the Jewish catacombs at Rome and elsewhere. Istabilicus qui et Donatus gives as cognomen in the Latin version the name for the Hebrew Nathan. Others are without such assignations, like Theodorus in Minorca or Priscus in the histories of Gregory of Tours. Also, Cosutius Eutychles, whom we know from a rather simple inscription on a double sarcophag found at Arles in 2009, does not sound Jewish. Sincerely, also not the first name of his wife, Pompeia, but we read here Pompeia, Judea. For Pylades, David Noy, the editor, has argued that in view of his illustrious public career, this man was not a pious Jew. But how could we know? He appears not as a pious Jew according to the standards of Rabbinic Judaism, but how normative was Rabbinic Judaism in the 2nd, 3rd century, especially in the far west. The Jews we are dealing with here were other Jews, most probably different in many respects from what we know, different with regard to customs, liturgy, communal organization, and so on. From the inscriptions, we have some hints to communal organization and hierarchies. We find rabbi, but also gerousiarchy, archisynagogy, or archisynagoge, presbytery, even presbytere. The liturgical practices like the super orans and education, doctoris legis, grammate, nomo didaskaloi, etc. But all this is not enough to gain a clear picture of social, cultural, and religious life. Even for the festivals remains uncertainty. As a brief text in Latin on Jewish festivals, De Solemnitatibus, which is most probably of Jewish origin, is not clear about the shofar blowing as we know it for new moons, Rosh Hashanah, and on Yom Kippur. These Jews were most probably widely disconnected from the developments in the East following the destruction of the temple and the slow emergence of Rabbinic Judaism, which remained far from reaching a hegemonial position in the West, probably not before the 8th or 9th century. But having no share in the developments of the East, thus Contrary to what has been argued most explicitly by Doron Mendels and Ari Etrey, not at all mean that these people were less Jewish or were nothing more than simply biblical Jews. My argument is that these Jews had a distinct culture based on more than biblical texts only, and this argument comes not fully ex silentio, but rather ex monumentis and ex manuscriptis. Four late classical early medieval synagogues of considerable dimensions are known from the West: Ostia Antica, Bova Marina, Hamamlif, and Kelibia, both letters in Tunisia. Others, like Elche, close to Alicante in Spain, or Carthago, are disputed. About 12 synagogues are known for Rome by epigraphic witnesses, but now none of them has been located inside the city of Rome. A look on Ostia and Hamamlif, Naro, gives a strong impression. Both are located prominently close to the port. In Ostia, also close to the public baths and a villa suburbana of considerable dimensions. Fortunately, from Naro, the dedication inscription has been preserved. Sanctam synagogam Narotinam prosalutem suam ancilla tua Juliana P. Presbytera, de suo proprium tesselavit. This is what we read in Latin, Sancta Synagoga. Certain evidence comes also from the Christian side. Julian of Toledo in the 7th century argued against the Jewish Doctorus Legis, whom a law by King Erwig of 681 even called Doctoris Iniquitatis. Scholars tend to read such statements as hints to the knowledge of Mishnah or other rabbinic text, and thus Menarosen has stated, quote, "The Mishnah was accepted all over the diaspora, thus maintaining at least the land of Israel's centrality as a spiritual center," quote end. I strongly disagree with such a Jerusalem-centered concept, especially since Julian seemed to be concerned about the possibility that Christians would be able to read these texts, what makes sense only if these texts were in Latin. I argue that other Jews in the other diaspora had other texts and formed a distinct culture of its own. It is no surprise that such texts, as they must have been written in Greek or better in Latin, are not known from medieval Jewish libraries. Here came to work what I elsewhere have called the Heil filter, meaning that Jewish texts in Greek survived rather in Christian reception than in Jewish libraries. A fortiori, Jewish texts in Latin could not make their way into Jewish libraries once Rabbinic Judaism had reached a hegemonic position, probably by the 7th or 8th century also in the West. So far, I'm speculating. However, traces of such texts can be identified in Christian texts and libraries. Rabanus Maurus, abbot in Fulda, was explicit about the use of a Jewish text for his commentary on Kings. In the dedicatory letters to Abbot Hildebrand of Saint-Denis in 829 and King Louis II, called the German, 834 or so, he noted that among other sources, he had consulted the text written by an, quote, anonymous Hebrew of our days, quite well versed in the knowledge of the Torah. Hebreus quita moderni temporibus eleges scientia non ignobiliter eruditus. The Maurice Jean Martinet identified in 1699 Rabban's source as the anonymous Questiones in Libros Regum et Parlepomenon, which he edited from 2 manuscripts so far not identified until today. In the meantime, a list of 61 manuscripts from the late 8th to the 13th century has been established. Following the Veronenses from the late 8th century and 4 9th century manuscripts from Reims, Saint-Denis, Orléans, and St. Gallen, and also parts of those Questiones in a manuscript, a famous manuscript of Barcelona, Barcelona 64, we can distinguish 4 groups of transmission. The Mosel area starting in the 11th century, the Norman English group in the 11th century starting, the group of the Alps starting in the 12th century, including the codices from Monte Cassino. The oldest of them is about 1050. And a continent-wide group of manuscripts which share certain characteristics between Bonport and Alzell in Saxonia, and provide, even though it is with the 12th century, the youngest group in many cases, this group provides the best reading. Together with 14th and 15th century manuscripts, the number may go well beyond 100, and we have quotations from those questiones in Libros Regum et Paralipomenon in the Glossa Ordinaria. Nevertheless, even that Rabanus was explicit about the Jewish author, we can see what happened to this Hebreus in a book written by Johann Baptist, or an article written by Johann Baptist Hablitzel in 1921. He followed Rama and Ginsburg and found no doubt that the author of this Questiones is not a real Jew. And he says, it should be shown that the Questiones Hebraica of an unknown Christian author were in a handwritten form in the hands of Rabanus Maurus, like he himself wrote to the Archchaplain Hilduin. He makes him a Christian also. Raban's statement, however, about the Jewish identity of the author finds support in two of the early manuscripts, those from Saint-Denis and Reims Cathedral, a donation by a certain Hincmarus Diaconus, probably the latter archbishop and rather not his nephew of the same name. Ras 118 has, as does the Saint-Denis manuscripts, which is Paris Bibliothèque Nationale 2384, has a prose title as follows on folio 53 verso. The interpretation of the Book of Chronicles according to the tradition of the Jews, which the reader should read with caution, begins here. The scribe's reservation becomes better understandable when looking into the title of the commentary on Samuel located in the same manuscript just before this and probably written by the same author. Here the title on folio 38 recto states, the cautious reader should well examine if that Jew who explained the aforementioned book in that way may perhaps in some of his readings deviate from the teachings of the church. 4 questions as to when, where, and for what audience a Jew may have written such texts. The titles do not provide any explanation. And the late medieval scribe also tried to correct the curiosity of a Latin text authored by a Jew stored in the Reims Cathedral by adding the name of Jerome to the title, thus ascribing the work to the church father. The philofilter became the Jerome filter. Since there is no reason to assume that these Latin texts had come to Reims or Saint-Denis in a translated form from originals in other languages, and even so another curiosity would remain, namely the reason for such translations. The modern editor of the text, Avram Saltman from Bar-Ilan University, was certain that it had originally been written in Latin. However, Saltman, here following Moritz Rame and Louis Ginsberg and also Hablitzel, Louis Ginsberg works on the Haggadah bei den Kirchenvätern, his Heidelberg dissertation of 1900. He concurred with the opinion of the Bavarian church historian Johann Baptist Hablitzel that the author must have been a convert. Saltman, throughout his commentary, measured the author, the Hebreus, against what he understood as normative, the rabbinic literature. Provided with this standard, he mocked the author's lack of education time and again, such as the poor level of his knowledge, I quote, and his absurd and irresponsible exegesis, as I quote, which was not compatible with, again quote, accepted Jewish interpretations, end quote. Thus, he recognized in the Hebreus a semi-literate convert who became a monk and offered himself to Theodulf of Orleans for the revision of the Bible, thus a charlatan who could play the role of expert in all areas of Hebraica Veritas as explicitly as undetected. Quote, He alone knew how pitifully inadequate was his scholarly equipment, that he had no written sources, that he had to rely on his already clouded memory of his elementary studies and his Jewish background. What escaped Saltman's attention is the 1699 statement by Martianet and Puget that the Jewish Western author of the 7th, 8th century, if he resorted to Hebrew biblical text at all, did not have a Masoretic biblical text available, and that he could hardly be approached by the standards of later rabbinic Judaism. You have at the left, you have this quote by Martianet and Puget, and I have put in blue the decisive part. Thereby, Saltman implicitly argued that the Ras manuscript had been written for a Christian clerical audience, which he thought to be curious to read what a Jewish exegesis could be. But this is not what the titles of the Ras and Saint-Denis manuscripts and Rabban intend to say. And you have here a look into the oldest manuscripts, which Saltman had not known for his edition, which is Verona Biblioteca Capitolare 23. And it should be dated to the last quarter of the 8th century. And it has no title at all. It just starts mit fuit vir unus, starts with the text, and it is not the best text at all, even that's the oldest witness for the text. Since the 11th century, first probably in the Codex of Lorraine, or of East French origin that survives from Freising, the Codex Latinus Monachensis 6318, as well as in the Codex from Durham Cathedral, and often thereafter, these commentaries were attributed to Jerome, sometimes directly by means of explicit titles, as you have it here, sometimes indirectly, as in the 11th century in Monte Cassino and Echternach, and by being added to other texts of the Church Father or those attributed to him. In this case, the Philofilter endowed a Jewish text with the authority of the Church Father and secured for it a place in a corpus of texts that may have served primarily for teaching and reverence purposes. However, the attribution of Jewish commentaries to Jerome can also be explained by the need to preserve texts that had to stand up to growing anti-Jewish resentment. One only has to think of the activities of Agobard of Lyon, Florus, and Amelot, developed in Lyon in the 820 and 40s. The insouciance with which Rabanus introduced his Jewish author in the 830s, even to the king, did not stand up to this. The titles of the codices of Reims and Saint-Denis, which were written a few decades later, are noticeably more reserved. And Angelomus of Luxeuil, who once again commented on the king's books a generation after Rabanus, was visibly at pains to conceal the share of the Jewish original in his own work. Now, a brief remark on the state of the editions and what I'm doing in the book I'm currently finishing, collations of the different readings, and what I can show you here in the example of 1 Samuel 3, sentence 2 to 3, is that actually Rabanus, together with a manuscript from Bonport, and this is the PN1, and from Corbie, St. Victor, PN4, and the manuscript from Lisborn, which is in Westphalia, a Benedictine monastery, the Berlin 1, they have actually the most reasonable reading in the Sicut est illud in libro exodi. The other version in Libro Levitico doesn't make sense, and like the St. Jacob Mainz manuscript, the Berlin 3, has in Hebreo doesn't make sense at all. But interesting is that the edition by Saltman has, together with the oldest manuscripts from Saint-Denis, Reims, Orléans, and so on, also the Monte Cassino 1, which is MO1 here in the list, and others, has not the best reading we can find for this text, because it's Sicut est illud in libro, and it's not said in which book the it is written. So Rabbanus and those manuscripts are the only ones which really show a full and reasonable sentence at that point. So I have the impression, I would suggest that it would be good to have a new edition which includes more text beyond the Questiones by the same author. I will come to this now. Here is a brief survey of what I call the tentative list of Latin Jewish texts established so far, and which will be discussed in detail in my forthcoming book. As we see beyond the above mentioned Questiones, a number of other texts of probably the same authorship, may be the same author or the same group, have survived, including a commentary on the Song of Deborah, Richter, Judges 5, a full commentary on Habakkuk, a piece on Zachariah that deals with the Jewish fast days as the Yunis, then a text of the Temptationes, Decem Tentationes of Israel in the desert, and some small pieces such as a short inventory of the Jewish feast days, the De Solemnitatibus, which I have already mentioned, which only partially fits into the cycle of Jewish holidays known today. Furthermore, we have the Lex Dei, the Collatio Legum Mosaicarum et Romanarum, a comparative collation of Roman and biblical provisions on criminal law, which despite all efforts to the contrary can, as Leonard Rutgers has proved, hardly be meaningfully described as a Christian text or a text of Christian origin and purpose. Then there is the Epistola Anne ad Senecam, a short prose piece which survives only in a 9th century manuscript from Cologne Cathedral, and Aaron Sturck has intensively worked on that. Finally, we have the opulent Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum of the so-called Pseudo-Philo, to which for decades scholars have wanted to ascribe a Hebrew original text and a Greek intermediate stage, but which, in the absence of any paleographic evidence for it, is, as first Talilan has argued, better understood as a Latin Jewish text probably written in Rome or elsewhere in Italy, and whose oldest evidence comes from Fulda and Auxerre in the 9th century, the oldest manuscripts for it from Fulda and the Salzburg-Bavarian area in the 11th century. There is not enough time here to present in detail the text and the criticism of the previous research, or to develop the idea that even Toldot Yeshu may have been written originally in Latin and later translated into other languages, including Hebrew. I will limit myself to 2 working examples, which I will present in more detail. First, the processing of Jewish traditions in the exegesis of the Christian school of Auxerre in the 9th century. And then the question of what can be gained about time, place, and self-conception of the author of the Questiones and the other exegetical pieces to be attributed to him. The example of Auxerre comes especially close to the motto of this meeting: shared scripture, divided faith. Hebrei dicunt, Hebrei habent, Hebrei volunt, also Hebrei insinuant, Hebrei autumnant. Such argumentative initia are encountered there everywhere. With digital instruments, it is easy to prove that here at the school of Auxerre, by no means, as medieval readers might have thought, Jerome was quoted. In the commentaries on Genesis and other biblical books, Auxerre simply made use of the pattern that Jerome had abundantly employed in his Questiones on Genesis and elsewhere. What is astonishing is what emerges behind it. Burton Wenham Edwards, in his edition of Remigius' commentary on Genesis, which is Corpus Christianorum Continuatio Medievalis 136, has compiled a whole list of passages where, in referring to Hebrei, there are quotations in the style of what is known as Targumim and Midrashim. To be precise, these are hardly direct quotations. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, for example, in which Edwards found a particularly large number of parallels, was, according to recent insight, not written in the 7th century, but in the 12th century only. This is the work by Gavin McDowell and others. that the authors of a Targum would then have drawn from the Latin commentary of Remigius, of all things, is, however, hardly likely. This is also true, by the way, for the opposite path. The assumption that Latin translations of Midrash, Genesis Rabbah, or older Targumim would have existed in Auxerre. There are no traces of this, and the question of the possible target audience of such translations does not allow a satisfactory answer. It can be excluded that the exegetes in Auxerre, and by the way also Alcuin before that, would have known enough Hebrew to help themselves directly to the text, because at least Remigius indicates that even that he made extensive use of Hebrew sources, he did not know any Hebrew and did not even have an idea of the right aligned order of the script when he was writing. In Hebreo ita hic ordo pervertitur, quia minorem numerum semper anteponunt. So he tried to read the age of Abraham, 175, and he found a translation, obviously, of Chamesh Quinkve in what he saw as the beginning, but it was written from from right to left. Excuse me. The exact proof of what was known in Auxerre and from where it was drawn is not easy to provide. A great number, about 40 passages alone on Genesis, where the exegetes refer to Hebrews, have in fact parallels in Jewish writings, but also in the church fathers, especially in Jerome, Augustine, and the Ambrosiaster as well. And in view of the libertarian citation system that was used, especially in Auxerre, in difference to Alcuin and Ravanus in Fulda, one does not want to trust any statement without reliable evidence. However, some examples, and I'm presenting here one of them, of the processing of templates can be named, which have been handed down only from Jewish contexts and are beyond any doubt. This is the case when interpretations are particularly unconventional and factually unnecessary. I will present one such example here in detail. Regarding Genesis 42, sentence 3, Descendentes igitur fratres Joseph decem ut emerem fomenta in Egypte. So the verse speaks about the 10 brothers of Joseph, and they go down to buy flour. Remigius writes that his interpretation comes from the Hebrews. According to this, Joseph's brothers, in their search for grain, entered the city one by one so that they would not be accused of espionage. And I have put in blue the decisive point per singulas portas intraverunt. The tradition in the Midrash Genesis Rabbah comes reasonably close to this. When the Midrash says, he set guards at the 10 gates and said to them, write down the name of each one who enters. The version in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan reads almost like a parallel text, also for justification. The rumor of Joseph's psychic powers carries back in place of the suspicion of espionage. The sons of Israel came each by a different gate, etc. And this applies in substance to Rashi, again on Genesis 42:5. They hid themselves to the crowd, etc., but each should enter by a different gate, that the evil eye might have no power over them, for they were all handsome and strong men. The question of the passing, of the crossing of gates seems rather secondary for the understanding of the verse of scripture, Genesis. One wonders why the idea of divided access arose at all. For the analysis of the course of tradition, then, this episode is highly instructive. For Remigius' interpretation, Christian literature offers no parallel before it. At least the number of gates played a role in the Midrash before Remigius. More explicit correspondences in content are found later in Rashi and in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. Other Targumim and the other rabbinic literature, however, offer nothing of the sort. Thus, without having to assert immediate dependencies, it follows that there were Jewish traditions tangible in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan and in Rashi later, which, without being able to make more precise statements about the ways of reception, were retrievable in Auxerre in the 9th century in a suitable way, namely in Latin version, even for an author who, as shown before, was not rudimentarily familiar with Hebrew or Aramaic. The second example is on Hebrae dikunt, Hebrae habent, etc. This is also a trademark of the text of the anonymous author of the Questiones. The text actually shares striking, not to say irritating, commonalities, but I cannot discuss that here. In the case of the anonymous, this creates yet another problem, the explicit distance toward the Hebrews. I state he is a Jewish author, but he even says Hebrae insinuant or Hebrae autumnant, thereby taking up terms which already Jerome had used. Nevertheless, I maintain with Rabanus that he was a Jewish author. He also does not oppose the Hebrews with we, and he does not offer any Christian echoes. Rather, we are dealing here with an inner Jewish descent. The Jewish author here and the Hebrews there. Here we have a Latin writer who is a Jew, who was struggling with interpretations of the Hebrews, or as he once said, the eruditi ilius linguae, the experienced people of that language. I therefore tend to understand the Questiones and the other texts of the author as the moment of the first encounter of Western Jews with the rabbinic scriptures, whose interpretations are partly accepted, partly rejected. And to come to conclusion, I present you a recent finding 3 weeks ago when I came over a manuscript from St. Jacob in Mainz, which is today in the State Library in Berlin and is formerly the Phillips 398. It took me some time to find where it is today because it's not among the Phillips manuscripts in Berlin, but it's Theologicus 1770. And another part is Quarto 718. So I checked some readings of the Questiones, and suddenly I came on one page over. You have it left up there on Phalek in the beginning of Paralipomenon, and I found a Hebrew transcription, interlinear annotation. And when I went through the manuscript, and I had not so much time before a lecture in Berlin, 3 hours, I had time to go through the manuscripts. There are many more annotations in Hebrew, probably from the time of the origin of the manuscript, which is late 12th or the 13th century. And it would be worth to check more St. Jacob Mainz manuscripts to find if there are more such indications for the use of the manuscripts, obviously, by Jews reading, commenting with clauses here and there the Latin text. The Corcoran Conference has in its title shared scripture and divided faith. In between, I would like to implement also shared resources. This corresponds with what Mordechai Cohen has suggested recently in a book, that Rashi learned his innovative exegetical methods for pshat, for literal exegesis, not from the Jewish Spanish grammarians, but from his Christian contemporary, Bruno de Carthusian. Therefore, Jewish and Christian authors, and maybe sympathizers in between in late antiquity, did not work in divided fields, but they obviously shared a common field of inherited knowledge, motives, and concepts of biblical interpretation, which they put, albeit differently, to use for their interpretation, and created midrash and exegesis as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Johannes. And as the panelists come up, just grab the water. A reminder to those who are on Zoom that they can submit questions to me in the chat, and I will direct them to our panelists also.
The light, I'm sorry, I
No,
can't.
I thought I was being,
No, it's
being rejected.
right in the
It's okay.
The spotlight.
Questions after 3 fine papers. Robbie, thank you.
I have a couple of questions for each, but I'll start with Deeana. Robbie Holland. Oh, right. Sorry. Hello. I have a couple of questions for each, but I'll start with Deeana, and others can obviously butt in. So at the beginning of your paper, you mentioned that there were 3 points of Nicholas's work, or motivations, and I'm unless I missed it, I don't understand the difference between 1 and 3. They each have to do with variations, but was there a finer distinction that I missed, or am I all?
Okay, so it's between 1 and 3, yeah.
And maybe
The
you could
first
speak
is-
into the microphone also.
Sorry.
Thank you.
This is
You can move
I
the
feel-
mic.
no, the mic is not the issue. It's
Oh.
the light. So forgive me. Okay. In the first exam, and by the way, this is his order, right? So I didn't make this up. But the first one is wanting to do more. The other one is wanting to put it all together so that instead of being distracted with all the very many things he might have to say about biblical text, he wants to just do difference, 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 difference. That's a separate issue than just adding more material. Does that make it clearer?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The other one was just a briefer comment. When you cited his work on Job 29:13, and he mentioned snakes. It seemed to me that he is channeling either Rashi or directly on Ezekiel 29:3 and Ezekiel 32:2 as a way of interpreting the text, using the Bible to interpret the Bible.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
I'll yield or go on to my next question as the group may. I'll ask one more and then I'll pass it on to George. You mentioned Nicholas as a possible Karaite, that it's been debated. So I don't know if in your reading you've come across any reference to a Karaite community in northern France. I have not, and it occurred to me that what the concern was more of Jews who were affected by the dissonance between Pshat and rabbinic tradition. And we have at least one contemporary, earlier but roughly contemporary, Yosef Bechor Shor, who refers to Gam Mibnei Amenu, these Jews, our parallel Jews, who are feeling the dissonance between Pshat and rabbinic Judaism and move away from rabbinics. So I'm wondering if you, both A, if you have any reference to Karaites, and B, if he could be referring to, just simply to other Jews.
Well, there's no reference to Karaites at that time at all, and in Europe. So I was searching for an expression how to express that he seems to have been a Jew who did not like rabbinics, but wanted to study the Bible. And that made him disappear from a rabbinical Jewish congregation in northern France. And he was left homeless. And so he turned to Christianity. And then he wrote about, my fellow Jews have some new books. Look at them and look what you find in the books. And it's blasphemy, it's writing against Jesus, it's writing against everything that's Christian truth. So it was meant just in this way. So that's why I said he's a non-Karaite, because there are no Karaites in Europe at that time. But how to express this? Should I say a biblical literal Jew or?
I have some material that I'd be happy to share with you.
Yeah. That's fine, and he seems not to have been the only one at that time. But this is an interesting point. This is always forgotten. I come from a tradition where you always say, well, look, if Christians argue against Jews, for example, in this disputation literature, they just imagine Jews because this cannot be. They have the Mishnah and Talmud, and I say no. Look at what could have been. And in this regard, the book by Talia Fishman was brilliant to me to read. That there's somebody else collecting material and showing. Well, there is no Talmud in Europe until let's say 1000, and then you have to ask: are all going to rabbinical Judaism as is always written in literature? And no, it isn't. But what's happening to those Jews who are not acquainted with the rabbinical writings? And it seems that Dahan was one of these. But he also saw the danger in his eyes of Talmudic writings. Whereas look at Petrus Alfonsi 1 century earlier. He just writes, there's a new book on benedictions. So it's Sefer Berachot. He does not write about the Talmud. He just says there's one new book, Liber Benedictionis, and in this is written this and that and that. And he says, I cannot follow. So that's why I converted. So I see Dahan in this tradition, but then he turns to be an enemy of Judaism at all. And this is the dangerous point in his figure. But it's very interesting, his traces are lost. He's just in this trial and this literature. And the funny thing is, or interesting thing, he is a convert who is no one. He's a nothing in his time. And he appeals to the Pope, and the Pope reacts. This is astonishing. How could he appeal to a Pope and the Pope reacts to him? That means he must have found a network that had connections to the papal court and brought the case to the Pope himself. And who was interested? Only the Dominicans at that time.
Jonathan.
Thank you. My question is also for Görge. I'm wondering if you can learn anything from the organization of the commandments and the list of commandments that you referred to, right? So the 13th and then the 14th centuries, there's this proliferation of works enumerating the commandments, right? It goes back to this passage in Brachot where, it's said that there are 613 and then nobody really knows exactly what they are. Yeah. But even more so, they can be organized either, to those that positive commandments versus negative commandments, between God and humans versus humans, and humans rational, non-rational. So in your list, does it follow the order in the Mishnah Torah, or is it, because it's also the late 13th that century that the Sefer HaMitzvot is translated into Hebrew, so which is a different organization.
Yes, but they're following the Mishnah Torah version, not the Sefer Mitzvot. So this was my discovery 20 years ago. I saw, well, this is not Sefer Mitzvot as it was always written, but this is the list from Mishnah Torah, which is not in all manuscripts. And I forgot in which direction it is, whether it is first the positive and then the negative, but it's the list that is inherited in Jewish tradition afterwards. So this is the one on which Maimonides wrote, I don't believe in it, but it's nothing, I cannot offer something better, so we leave it with this. And the interesting point is it's translated into Latin, following completely the list that Maimonides gave in Mishnah Torah, and it's not commented. It's just written there, and Christian scholars used it. I've shown in my first book that they actually knew this list and came back to it every now and then.
Other questions from? Yeah, Franz.
Thank you for 3 absolutely stimulating and interesting papers that make us reconsider some of the things we thought we knew. My question to Johannes is very detailed. Johannes, is there any idea of when and where specifically this text of starts to be attributed to pseudo Jerome, or starts to be attributed to Jerome, I should say. The reason I'm asking this is that the text surfaces in Andrew of St. Victor, who seems to have appeared to use it twice, once as Hebraios and once as Jerome. At least that's what Saltman thought. What he did not realize is that the attributions to Jerome of that same text were added into the manuscripts in a later stage. So in the 12th century, Andrew takes this text to be a Hebraios. The person who adds to his manuscript clearly says, well, here's Jerome. I think that that's an English manuscript tradition, but it could be a Paris manuscript tradition. So it's interesting to me to see when do people start thinking that this is Jerome.
Okay, I think I should respond immediately. And thank you, Franz, for this question. And it cannot be said with certainty where this manuscript, switch from a Jewish author or anonymous author to Jerome took place, because the earliest witnesses for the attribution, the explicit attribution to Jerome, are in the Dahan manuscript from at latest from the end of the 11th century, if not earlier, a manuscript written in France, brought to Dahan by the first Norman bishop of Dahan, and the other manuscript is, which I showed you, from Lorraine, which was preserved in Freising. These two manuscripts they belong to quite different text families. So it would be problematic to say it's an English manuscript tradition or Northern French or an Eastern French, because there must have been a shift between these. In the stemma, there is a question mark. When does this separation take place, which already includes in single manuscripts the attribution, obviously, to Jerome, sometime before the mid of the 11th century. It must have happened somewhere in France, not in Italy, where we can assume the place of the origin of the text itself. But the attribution to Jerome must have happened after the 9th century, at some point in Northern Europe, probably in France, be it in the West, be it in the East, be it in the North, but we don't know at what place. But it's still possible that more manuscripts will come up. As during my research, I came over several manuscripts which were not yet attributed by Saltman. He has a list of 50 manuscripts. I have now a list of about 100 manuscripts. And there may be more. Perhaps one day we will have a more precise answer to this question.
Thank you. I have a question if no one else has one right now. Which is that this came up yesterday, and now in Johannes, in your talk, and Görge, in yours also, this question of when Rabbinic Judaism becomes a factor. And Johannes, you said 7th to 8th century, and Görge, you said more 11th century. What's lying between those two dates? And is it a matter of geography? Is it a matter of what's going on there? So,
Ruth, let's try with Görge together an answer. I think it's about geography, because I'm speaking of the Mediterranean, and there we have the traces of the reception of Rabbinic Judaism until the very west, until Spain, in the 8th, 9th century. But I guess Görge is completely right to say, well, when we are speaking about the north, about the Ile-de-France and Alsace-Central, the Champagne and the Rhine area, sincerely not before the year 1000. So I think there is no dissent. We look from different angles onto the same issue.
okay, certainly when one talks about the liturgical text coming dealing with the communication back and forth between the Gaonim in Babylonia and Spain, we're talking end of the 9th century. Those are Jews who don't know Rabbinic Judaism. They're asking really fundamental questions of the rabbis about the 875 plus or minus.
Yes.
So, and yet at the same time, you have a community in Italy that seems to know something more, somewhat earlier.
Yes, of course.
So,
in the Mediterranean, but this is easier for transportation of letters and other forms of communication, whereas the Central European Jews were not that communicative to the rest of the world at that time.
So we need to be sensitive in these discussions to the geographical spread of this.
But if we look at this disputation literature that I that I only touched in my answer, this is very interesting to see that even Gilbert in the 11th century knows that there's a school of rabbis in Germany, but and his opponent learned there, but all that he reports from Judaism is more like the Judaism that Johannes Heil presented to us. That is a Latin, Bible-orientated Judaism. And this is, Crispin is the latest to write on a disputation that is in the old style. And then after that, there seems to have been a change. Then there's the introduction of Hebrew, then there's a new style of learning that, of course, started earlier. So it's introducing very slowly, first by language, then by texts. And when in the 13th century, it's clear. There's a fixed text of the Talmud, but this is also interesting in the translations of the Latin Talmud, that we can discover that Talmud is the Gemara, including the comments by Rashi. This is the Latin Talmud at that time. And it's clearly indicated this is the comment by Rashi and this is Talmud text.
And then another piece of the question was that you made mention of Piyut and Piyut evidence. And there it's interesting because if we know who the author of the Piyut is, often we can date the Piyut.
Yes.
And also then analyze it as to whether its content is being informed by rabbinic literature or not.
Yeah.
How does that help the dating question?
It doesn't help us at all. Chen Merchavia and Wout van Beckum tried to find out which texts are referred to, but they only came to the Samuel. This was the only one they could identify. But it's very interesting to see that there's one introduction of a verse, and then there's a commentary by Rashi. And then there's the next text, and there's a further text, and then there's again a commentary by Rashi. So it must have been something that was perhaps kept in the school of Rashi and Troyes. So perhaps the 11th century.
This particular text, although
This
there is...
particular text. And it's written Sefer Keruva. Nobody knows this. We know this term. And there's a lot of literature written on Keruva, but we don't know this, but...
Sefer Keruva.
Sefer Keruva.
Kufresh Vav.
Yeah.
Vav. Yeah.
But we know this term, but we do not know a book called Sefer Keruva. So, and Wout van Beckum spent a lot of lines in the book that I edited on this special formulation, but he could not explain where it comes from. He just says it's a riddle, and the greater riddle is that the translators left it. Liber Krubot, Sefer Keruva.
Because they didn't know how to translate that term any better than we do.
No.
Yeah. Dan.
So speaking of dates and numbers, so I have trouble counting all the commandments in the Torah, but I have even more trouble counting the Decalogue, and I just wondered what disputations might have occurred in terms of the way the Christians and Jews commented on the way the Ten Commandments were enumerated and what they counted and what they didn't. Are there any texts that show that discuss that?
I should give this question to Deeana because Nicholas of Lyra could be the first reference in this regard, or Johannes Heil because he showed this commentary on the Decalogue. In the text that I know, I only know from Meister Eckhart the commentary on the Decalogue, but he does not discuss the numbers. He just discusses some of the precepts there. But perhaps you too.
I leave the answer to Deeana because I have in my elaboration, my research on the Genesis commentaries, no instance from what I could answer the question now. So no comment from my side.
And this is going to be really unsatisfying, but I don't have a whole lot to offer either. Nicholas of Lyra in his Bible commentary does talk about the differences between Hebrew accounting and Christian accounting, but I haven't worked on that material in at least 15 or more years, and I just don't remember exactly what he says. And he's not inventing it, he's drawing from previous material as well. I don't know, there might be someone else who is in this room.
Well, my Andrew St. Victor is back home in Grand Rapids, otherwise I would pull it off the shelf and say, oh.
They do talk about it. They do talk about it, but it's also not the most exciting. It's not a particularly fraught conversation, as I recall. So nothing. Yeah, except that Robbie has.
Perhaps we should have a conference on that.
It's not as. I'm sorry.
So I just suggested to have a conference on that matter here in Boston, perhaps in 2 years, and you're going to invite us.
I would suggest that it's not as fraught because they share the texts. Don't forget, the term "the Ten Commandments" is a Christian term. It's not a Jewish term. We have a lot more than 10, right? So, but the idea that the Decalogue itself is shared by both Judaism and Christianity, with all the attendant differences between Deuteronomy and Exodus and later in Exodus, etc., those were all shared traditions. So the question of how do you count them, which is number one and which is number two, etc., that each tradition has internal consideration of those numberings, but they agree on the text. You find much greater difference once you get into, say, Exodus 21, where the Jews think that's really, really important, and the Christians clearly do not. Then you have lots of, polemical texts by Jews against Christian readings.
I would say the other thing is that there's not always a reference to the commandments by number, but instead by content. So the numbers aren't question. It's a side question to when do the numbers become an issue at all? Yeah, Franz.
On the Ten Commandments, I think even there's a difference between Catholics and Protestants on which one is the second commandment. But my question is for Deeana. Maybe the low number in manuscripts, well, it's relative. I wish I had a text with 20 manuscripts, or maybe I didn't. I mean, 5 sometimes is enough to work with when you do an edition. But what was the purpose of this text if it seems so detailed, philological? Here's the difference between Hebrew and Latin. And it's just a list of differences. I'm always amazed at these kind of philological, learned Latin discussions don't seem to have any influence on who is copying the Bible. They're not suddenly going to say, oh, we have to do a new edition of the Vulgate or a new version of the Vulgate. It seems like a very academic discussion. So for who was this really intended? If this is for, maybe traveling Franciscans, this is not going to help them make a good sermon. So I just want to see if you have any ideas to who is the audience for this text.
So thank you for that question. I've thought about this a lot. A few years ago, I was asked to do a keynote for a graduate student conference where the topic was failure. I can't tell you how that feels to be asked to give the keynote on failure by graduate students in your field, but it was actually a lot of fun. I had so much fun with that. And I used the luxury copies of the Postilla as an example of failure, because I said, and at that time I hadn't done all the manuscript work, and the ones that come up most repeatedly that exist are these gorgeous illuminate. And I'm like, how do you take this text aimed at poor students and it only exists at the back of complete collections of Nicholas's postilla and all of his other treatises, and we are just in this volume going to give you the complete Nicholas for your collection with gold leaf, right? So in that sense, the circulation of this text is just to have the complete Lyra. And I noticed that a lot of the reason I divided the manuscripts the way I did in that slide is to show the other place you see it is the minor works of Lyra, like not even minor exegetical works, but these are the anti-Jewish treatises, or this is, so that I don't think that actually is how he imagined it would circulate. I think the fact is it circulated even less than the manuscript tradition suggests, because it's circulating in places where people probably were not really reading it, but it was there to provide a comprehensive package of some aspect of Lyra, if that makes sense. So that's the first thing I would say. The reason I spent time focusing on the Avignon manuscript is because I do think that that's what Nicholas wanted. He wanted these, it's a tiny, it really is like a little paperback, not 300 euros either, probably pretty cheap. And it has just enough rubrication to make it easy to follow so that you can use it. And I think that's sort of the ideal textbook that seems either it really did take off and they were such poor copies and they were small and they've all been lost, or what he imagined proved not to be of interest or useful to people. So here's where I'm going with this research. So one question I have, coming back to this text at all, is because the Lollard Society people, the Wycliffite Bible people, they're very interested in Nicholas these days. And so I've been doing some panels and workshops with them and the Czech Bible people. And one of the things they've discovered, it shouldn't be a discovery, but it is how much the translators of these vernacular Bibles were using Nicholas of Lyra. And then I had the question, I wonder if they're using, this would be really handy if you were a translator. And it shouldn't be hard to find, because since the content differs in the De Differentia and the Postilla, it's not like you don't know where they're getting it. You're going to know if they're getting it from these texts. So this summer, I have some manuscripts I'm going to be seeing from these early Wycliffite Bibles to see if I can find something. The first, when I looked, I did find one manuscript online that did include Job, which is what I was working on, and there was nothing from the De Differentia. It was all coming from the Postilla. So this is why I sort of get stuck with, what did Nicholas think this text was meant to do? It was meant to point out that you have this Bible over here, and it's the Christian Bible, and you can perfect it, and you can perfect your understanding of it by reference to Hebrew and Jewish material. And then there's a Jewish scripture, and it's somehow over here, and it's not the same thing, and it's important to catalog its differences. I don't know if that really gets at your question.
So thank you. We're actually out of time, so we should turn to lunch next. And you can ask your question privately over lunch, quite happily. So we reconvene at 1 o'clock for the next panel, for the final panel also of our conference, and looking forward to those papers and to the conversation then, and to informal conversation over lunch now. Thank you very much.